Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Hey everyone, and welcome to Raising Parents, the Parenting Science Insights podcast, produced by Ella Massal, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Dina Sargent. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome back to the show. Today we're discussing the fascinating topic of how infants develop emotional responses. Now, crying profusely in the middle of the night for a plethora of possible reasons is arguably one of the most notorious examples of a baby's first foray into displaying emotions. In the parenting sphere, this is so widely discussed, the mystery of why my baby is crying and it's 4 a.m. and I just want to get to bed. But apart from crying, there are a slew of other less attention-grabbing emotional responses that infants display that can tell you a lot about the stage of emotional development that they're in. So in this episode, we're looking at the various emotional responses to look out for, what they mean, as well as signs that an infant may be struggling with emotional development and what this means in the long run. And to guide us through this, we're joined by psychology professor Vanessa LoBue, who is currently based at Rutgers University and specializes in infant and child development. So welcome to the show, Vanessa. It's great to have you here.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm really keen to dive right into this topic with you. But before we get started, I would like to get to know more about you and what you've done in the past. So tell us a bit more about your background and what compelled you to study infant and child development.
That's a great question. So I got my psychology degree at Carnegie Mellon University a long time ago now. And I really wanted to learn more about infant and child development. So I ended up going to graduate school at the University of Virginia for my Ph.D. And what really compelled me to study infants and young children is I initially was really interested in what makes us who we are. So, why am I the person that I am? Why are you the person that you are? Why are human beings the way we are? And in order to find out, I thought the best way would be to go back to the beginning, which is infant and child development. So that's why I think infants are so fascinating.
So what have you found out so far about why is it the way that we are? Like, how are we like this from all of your study in infant development?
Well, I mean, what I've learned is that babies, right from, I mean, even before they're born, they're learning and they're adapting to their environments. We are amazing creatures, and infants are amazing creatures. And a lot happens in the first few years of life because development just happens faster during that time. So if you think of what I look like now and what I looked like 10 years ago, I mean, you can tell that I'm older now, but there's not that much change in my appearance. There's not a lot of change in lots of the things that I do, the way I think, the way I feel. But if you look at an infant versus a 10-year-old, I mean, it's completely different. So that's why infancy is so fascinating, is because you sort of get like a very, very fast developmental window into changes in our brains and bodies. And you can really look at how we adapt to our environments and how we learn.
Yeah, that is so true. And a question that's always plagued me is like, how do we even know to breathe the moment that we get out into the world? Like that's fascinating and wild. Life is wild to me. But with regards to infant development, what are some common misconceptions that you've heard?
Oh, the common misconceptions about infant development. Well, I
Yeah.
mean, the most common misconception that I can think of is that everything is mom's fault. So we think about the infant's environment as being shaped by the parents, which it is, but I wouldn't say that everything is the parents' fault. I would say that a lot of what the parents do really matters. So I would flip it the other way and say that, parenting matters, parents matter, and we can't blame parents for everything. We need to, but we do need to support them.
Yeah, I love that idea, that rhetoric so much, because I feel like recently there's been a lot of parental anxiety going around in the parenting sphere. I'm not a parent myself, but I do
Hmm.
like keep up with what parents are saying. And yeah, it seems like there's a lot of anxiety going on about how to be a good parent. And, sometimes I reckon it would be really good for parents to hear, like, hey, a lot of what you're doing is actually really good. Like, yeah, you make mistakes every now and then and it messes up, but all in all, you're doing a good job. And I think that's a great preface for our topic for today. But before we go further into detail, I would love to get to know you a little bit better. So this is Have You Met Vanessa? This is a rapid fire style icebreaker. So please answer the following questions within a few words. I will say a word and you tell me what comes to mind. Book.
Love books. The book I'm reading right now is called The Psychopath Inside. It's about a professor who happens to be a very functioning psychopath, and that's what I'm reading.
I love that. I mean, not I don't love functioning psychopaths. I like reading about functioning psychopaths, to be clear.
Same.
And movie.
Movie. I haven't watched a full movie, I have to confess, in a very long time because I'm obsessed with television. So I am currently watching John Hamm's new show, Your Friends and Neighbors, on Apple TV. But I haven't watched a movie in a really long time.
That is so fair. I feel like, there's been a time where, movies weren't really my pace and TV shows really are more my speed. But yeah, movies are great too. And what's the TV show you're watching? What is it about?
It's called Your Friends and Neighbors. It's John Hamm is the star, and it's about a guy who, he's a Wall Street guy who makes millions of dollars. They live a very fancy suburban life, and then he loses his job, so he starts stealing things.
Oh, that's really
That's the basic
interesting.
gist. Yeah, it's
And
very
what
good.
about and what about podcasts?
Oh, I love Morbid. It's called Morbid. So, I mean, if you're going to ask me about my guilty pleasure at some point, which you might, it is true crime. So, hence the psychopath inside. And I'm listening to the podcast. I do like a little bit of science, though. I am a scientist. So, the psychopath inside is written by a scientist. Morbid is narrated by two sisters, and one of them is an autopsy technician. So, she knows a lot of the science I know behind what she's doing. And I just love it.
That is so interesting. I've always
Hmm.
wanted to talk to an autopsy technician, so that's
Yeah.
going to have to go on my listen list.
It's
And
called
what about?
Morbid. It's great.
I will look that up. And what about role models? Is there anyone that you've looked up to?
Role models. That is a really great question. One thing I'll say about role models is it, you know, when I was young, besides, my mom and the women in my family, a lot of the media didn't have a lot of good role models for women, especially like science women. I loved Scully from the X Files. But even the TV shows I used to watch as a kid, most of the characters were men, were male. It's really nice now to see that girls are growing up with a lot of female role models, a lot of main female characters in their shows and movies. But I mean, I would say my role model, if I had to choose, would be my parents. They're wonderful.
Oh, that's so sweet. And what about a course or class that you've taken that has stuck with you to this date?
I would say my very first psychology class, and I was in 12th grade in high school, and I took psychology for the first time, and it changed everything. It made me want to study the brain forever. So that is definitely the most noteworthy class. And then my child development class, when I was in college, it was taught by Dr. Sharon Carver, who's still at Carnegie Mellon. She was also a role model to me. And she once cold called on me. She memorized everybody's name on the first day of class. I still have never been able to do that, and I don't know how she did it. But she cold called me on this paper that I had clearly not read. And I gave some really dumb answer that was clearly wrong. And so I went home and I read that paper and I studied it. And I ended up going to grad school with the author of that paper because I liked it so much.
That's such an incredible story. And I'm sure we've all been there where we've been like cold called in class and then we go back and study profusely afterwards. It's the pipeline into adulthood, I believe. And the last question I have for you is, what is the most important lesson that you've learned from all of these?
I would say the most important lesson I have learned from all of these things and from my job and my life is not to be afraid to be wrong. And I think we want to normalize being wrong and saying that you're wrong. So part of science is being wrong. That's part of what we do, or not knowing. So I think saying that you don't know or that you were wrong about something and you've changed your mind is what science is all about, right? It's about discovery. It's about having a hypothesis and finding out that your hypothesis is wrong. So, most of the times where my research has been the most exciting is when I was wrong about something and it took me in a whole different direction. So I would say the most important lesson I've learned through my life from my parents, from school, from my job, from my kids, from being a mom is don't be afraid to be wrong and don't be afraid to say that you were wrong.
Yeah, I love that idea so much. Yeah, life is messy and you make mistakes, and it's okay to do that. And you probably learn more just by accepting that you have made a mistake or that you've been wrong in the past. So, thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. It's been such a pleasure to get to know you a little bit better. And now let's talk a little bit more about how infants develop emotional responses. And for starters, I would love to get your definition of a few key terms. Firstly, I would love to know what you think parenting means.
Parenting. So parenting wasn't a verb, I think, until the 80s. Um, it wasn't like something that we did, like it wasn't like an action that some of us were better at and some of us were not as good at. I would say that parenting just means being a parent in whatever way that means, whatever that means to you, and whatever form that is in your house and what's best for your kids. So parenting is going to look different between families in the same neighborhood, across families in different states in different countries. And what's most important about being a parent is raising a healthy child. So, you know, it's important to realize that there really isn't a definition of parenting other than you are the parent of a child and you need to work that out and do that however best you can with the environment, with the circumstances you have, and with the personalities of your kid, because they're all different.
They truly are all different. I mean, like, I think my mom's experience with raising all three of us, I have two siblings, was so vastly different. And each time she thought like, oh yeah, this will be a breeze, like I already have a kid. But it was just the complete opposite direction every single time. um yeah. But more to today's topic about infant development, how would you define it? What constitutes as infant development? What are the stages? What are the windows, periods of windows that we're looking at? Periods of windows, sorry. Um, what are the periods of infancy are we looking at?
Good question. That's a very good question. So infancy is basically a time where a child doesn't have language. I think that's where the term actually came from. So usually we think of infancy as 0 to 2. Some people stretch it from 0 to 3, but most of the time when we think of the infancy period, we're thinking of the preverbal period. So we're thinking usually from birth to age 2.
Yeah, and how would you describe the relationship between parenting and infant development?
I think it's really vital. I mean, I think that those first 2 years of life, the brain changes so much. So much is happening. I mean, you're going from a a newborn that can barely control your limbs to by 2 a walking, talking human being with a personality and with the ability to reason somewhat morally, the ability to say no to your mom. So I think the relationship between an infant and the parent in infancy in particular is really, really important.
And is there any research that tells us a bit about the connection between emotional experiences as an infant and their development?
Yes, that's a very big question, and there's a whole lot that tells us about what happens in infancy and their long-term development and the relation between these things and parenting. So, for I'll just give you one example because there are so many. So, one of the things that's most important in the first few years of life is the relationship between the infant and the primary caregiver. We often say mom because it's often the mom that is spending the most time with the infant, but it doesn't have to be the mom. It could be the dad. It could be the grandfather. Some babies have two dads. It's whoever the primary person is. Forming that attachment relationship is really important. And what we're learning more and more of now is how the presence of that relationship helps the baby's emotional development. So, babies raised, for example, in orphanages in Romania, there's lots of research on these kids. They don't grow up with a primary attachment figure in the first few years. What we see is the part of the brain that processes fear, the amygdala, develops faster in those babies. And you think it's the opposite that these babies would be behind, but what's happening is their fear center is maturing faster because there's no what we think is that there's no one there to protect them, right? So the presence of the mother or the primary caregiver buffers the development of that system to promote exploration and not being afraid of things in the first year of life. So just her presence there, being that sort of buffer between the baby and the unknown, promotes exploration instead of fear of new things. So we know that the parent's presence in those first 2 years of life is really setting the stage for their emotional repertoire later on.
That's a really interesting example. However, I'm really curious to know the example that you cited was based on orphanages, which are really extreme case. So I'm curious to know what is the difference in amygdala development for, let's say, um, for example, if an infant they have the care of one or two parents, albeit, perhaps they sleep in a different room and they don't get the same level of physical intimacy as they would if they were to sleep in the same room as their parents or their caregivers. Yeah, what's the difference in amygdala development between the two?
That's a great question. So there is no evidence that there's any. So the example of the orphanage is a very extreme example, right? It's like a baby growing up with a primary caregiver versus without. But there's really no evidence that not co-sleeping or having a baby in their own room is going to do anything detrimental. But there is evidence that touching and cuddling is very good for babies, really good for their emotion regulation. So babies aren't born with the ability to sort of control their own emotions. So they need mom or dad or a caregiver to do it for them. And touch is a really good way to do that. So babies who are swaddled, babies who are cuddled more, they tend to have better emotion regulation abilities later on. They tend to sleep better. So cuddling, you can cuddle your baby and not sleep in the same room as them. So in fact, in the US, although I should say that co-sleeping is really common in other places in the world, in the US is generally discouraged. And it doesn't mean that you won't have a healthy attachment with your baby.
Yeah, that's really good to know. Just because, I've looked online and a lot of parents are really anxious about the fact that perhaps they might not be co-sleeping. That may be an issue with emotional development, and all sorts of things. And I'm really cautious about, over sensationalizing that little bit of, what you're doing with an infant and how drastic your actions may be. So that's really good for parents to know. Another thing that I wanted to ask is, how much of an infant's emotional response is innate versus shaped by the environment. We talked a little bit about this in the introduction, and I would love to know a little bit more about that.
That's a great question. So there's something called infant temperament. You might have heard of it. It's basically the baby's own style of reacting to changes in the environment, their own style of emotional responding, right? And any mom who has more than one baby knows that babies have temperaments right from birth. Like they might even say that these babies have their own personalities. So you can think of temperament as sort of like a precursor to personality. So, personality is temperament plus experience from the environment. But temperament is something that we think of as innate. It is something that we're born with, meaning that we all come in with the sort of baseline way of responding emotionally to our environments, and then our experience with that environment, our experience with our parents, with our siblings, with the world around us, sort of adjusts that temperament.
Yeah, and is there any evidence to suggest, what exactly in the environment does affect an infant's emotional response or development, like family dynamics, sibling dynamics, which are the most important ones to look out for?
Well, I mean, you can argue that everything does, but the most important thing I would say is that you have a sensitive, responsive parent. And what that means differs from country to country, from family to family, right? Being responsive can be different for different people. But what's most important is that the infant learns that when they are in distress, when they need something, they have someone there who's going to respond to that need. And that helps them build a secure relationship with their caregivers and sort of um, creates the foundation for their emotional responding going forward. If they're feeling secure, and they feel that they have a way, they have someone to help them cope with their emotions, then that baby is going to be more willing to explore, more willing to experience things on their own. So that developing that first relationship is really important, and what predicts it is how responsive the parents are to the baby. And some babies need more sensitivity than others, so some babies have a more reactive, I would call it reactive temperament, meaning that like they don't like going to new places, they're going to give you a hard time about changing the diaper, they don't like new people, their general response to new things is sort of like no thank you. That kid is probably going to need more sensitive responding than a kid who's just really outgoing from the get-go, really welcoming of new experiences, new. And there's nothing wrong with either kind of temperament. You can think of it as like we all sort of have a baseline for reacting to things in the environment. More laid back people who don't, their baseline is higher, meaning like it takes a while for them to have a big emotional response. Whereas others, you might know, react to everything. So those kinds of things are remnants of our temperament. So temperament is relatively stable across time, but of course moves. But like, we still have remnants of that biological predisposition to respond emotionally to changes in the environment.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, across the board, what are the very first few emotional responses that infants tend to display? What should parents be looking out for?
So that's a great question. So, just let me give you two more definitions because I know you wanted to establish some definitions. So, I wouldn't say that the emotions that we experience, like the specific emotions like anger and sadness and fear, are there at birth. So, what is there at birth is what I would call positive or negative affect, which is feeling, right? You feel good or you feel bad. um, that's sort of how babies respond to the world in the beginning. They just like yes or no, right? They're stimulated or they're overstimulated. Um, Real emotions, so just what we call discrete emotions or like very specific emotion categories, require some understanding of the world, right? So emotions are affect plus some kind of processing of the environment. So emotions are always about something in the environment. And so the first real emotions we see are happiness, which is great. You start to see a baby smile between 1 and 2 months of age. They usually smile toward their caregivers, people that are familiar. So that requires you sort of learning what are the things that are rewarding, right? Like I, good things happen when mommy's around. I like mommy. The next one that emerges is probably sadness and anger around 4 to 5 months. So think about times when you're angry. What causes us to feel anger? Usually it's because some norm that we've expected has been violated. So someone is doing something that goes against our expectation of what should happen, or we feel like we've been treated unfairly. So, a baby doesn't really experience discrete expressions of anger until they learn that to expect things from their environment. Usually it's with like a loss contingency. So baby is throwing something on the floor over and over again. This is really fun. Mommy takes the toy away. That interrupts a very expected contingency. And what do you get? You get screaming and anger from a baby. So, but that takes a few months for the babies to sort of learn I can have an effect on the world that is predictable. So I can do this thing and the same thing's going to happen over and over again. I really like that. If mom stops me from doing that, I'm not going to like that. So that's anger. And then fear, something like fear requires that you're evaluating that something is threatening to you, right? Like, I don't like this because this is a threat. That takes even longer. So we don't see fear until 9 to 12 months when a baby has sort of learned these are familiar people, these are unfamiliar people, and I don't like those like I don't like that this is unfamiliar. This I don't like. This is something that's threatening to me. So, emotions sort of unfold that way over time in infancy as infants learn more about the world around them. So, the emotions that tend to come last are what we call the self conscious emotions, embarrassment and shame. And when you think about these emotions, in order to feel embarrassment, I have to understand that you have some expectation about how I'm going to behave, or the world has some expectation about what's the good behavior and what's the bad behavior. And I have to know that I did something that other people are going to think is bad. So that's a whole other level of reasoning, which is why you don't see those emotions till 18 to 24 months, because it takes more reasoning. So the more reasoning, the later the emotions develop.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it's really, really fascinating that there's so many different stages where infants will develop a certain emotion for whatever reason it might be. So, what are the various ways that babies learn to recognize and interpret the different emotions, with their caregivers or the people around them?
Well, that's actually something I'm studying in my lab right now. We're trying to figure out how babies learn what emotions are from their caregivers' emotions, right? But also from their caregivers' responses to the baby's emotions. So we really actually don't know how they acquire emotional responding. So what we're doing in the lab right now is we're using what we call a head-mounted eye tracker. They're like glasses that look like this, and the baby wears them and the mom wears them, and the glasses measure exactly where the baby and the mom are looking. So we look at their interactions with each other to see what the baby is seeing, what emotional responses are they learning from the mother, and how then does that predict how they process emotion later.
That is, I would say, far too interesting. Like, I mean, first of all, the idea of baby wearing glasses is just humorous to me.
And
But also
adorable.
the fact, yeah, adorable. And the
Hmm.
fact that you're using these to conduct research is just, I am just blown away. I love that so much. But do we know yet what are the common mistakes that parents or caregivers make when responding to their baby's cries or emotional cues, anything like that?
I don't know that we know any common mistakes that they've made that parents make. I think one mistake they might make that I'm trying to encourage parents not to make is they neglect their own emotional health. Um, because parents are busy, especially new parents with a baby. You have so much to do, but babies are learning how to express themselves by your cues and the way you express yourself. So maternal depression, anxiety is so very common. And like it's a mother's instinct to take care of the baby before yourself. But one of the things to remember is your own mental health is so very important when you're a caregiver, because the infant is going to be reacting to your emotional responses. So if your emotional responses are off or you're not having a good day, I mean, that's okay. But I would say that, chronic depression, chronic anxiety, again, the spin here isn't that everything's mom's fault. It's that we need to, really protect parents' mental health, because parents are really stressed out. That's going to trickle down to the kid. It's important not to neglect your own mental health, because your own mental health is really important for the functioning of your child's.
Yeah, 100%. And I grew up in a household where my mom was constantly stressed out, consciously anxious about every single thing. And obviously, this is not her fault because, her life is just incredibly chaotic and you barely have the time for yourself. But that's the thing, like you should take time for yourself. And I inadvertently picked those behaviors up and I've mirrored them. And there's so many points in my life, my daily life, where my partner will point out, like, you sound like your mom right now. You talk like you're doing this exactly like your mom. It pains me, but it is true. And I've had to like unlearn some of that as well. And she's unlearning some of that too, which is good for both of us. But it definitely is, it is such a common story that you hear. Such a common sighting to see a child mirroring their parents' behaviors and attitudes later in life, whether inadvertently or not. Um, but another thing I'm really curious to know about is what are some signs that an infant might be struggling with their emotional responses of development? At what point should a parent go like, there might be something missing here?
You mean emotionally
Yeah,
or just in general? Emotionally? Um, I
emotionally.
would,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I would say it's very hard to tell because emotions are all over the place. And we think that because we all experience emotions, that we all experience them the same way, which can't be further from the truth. We've all experienced and express emotions differently, even though we have a word for anger and we've all felt anger, and we have a word for fear and we've all felt fear. Even the way we express these things is going to vary extremely from one person to the other. So it's hard to know, but I would say parents, if they're concerned, should ask their pediatrician. They should get help if they need help. I think there's no reason to sweat this out alone if you're worried. And I think a lot of parents are worried. So it doesn't hurt to talk to your pediatrician or talk to your own doctor if you're worried about your own mental health, with uh, if you're a parent. Um, in terms of problematic emotions, I think it's really hard to tell in the first couple of years. It's easier to tell much later on in school, but when a child is first developing, there's a lot happening at the same time. So, for example, like you hear about the terrible twos, and kids get really emotional during that time. But the part of the reason why is because their emotions and their ability to feel far surpasses their ability to regulate those emotions, explain those emotions, talk about them, know what to do with them. So, in the first couple of years, you have to wait it out, especially because like they're just learning what emotions are. The best advice I could give is make sure you're taking care of your own during that time so that you can be the most responsive parent that you can be. But like, I'll say that like letting a baby cry themselves to sleep for sleep training, like these kinds of like one-off things, it's not going to hurt the baby. Like it's babies cry and that's okay.
That's really good to know and really interesting as well. So thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. It's been such a pleasure to pick your brain about this subject. Now let's move on to the break segments, where we are doing questions from the internet. This is where we pose burning questions from netizens to an expert like yourself for their insight and advice. So first question we have here: Do infants first understand emotions concretely or reflectively? When a child is first learning the word sad, would they interpret it as, for instance, a picture of a person crying, or would it be linked to their actual emotions?
Oh, that's a really good and hard question. I don't know who this writer is, but it's a good question. Um, I would say it's really hard to know. They learn to label these emotions in others first, like in photos. Like we know that like between 3 and 5, they can label sadness in a photo. I think it's probably that's easier first because they're seeing sort of stereotypical facial expressions in these photos, right? Which is not actually what we look like when we express these emotions necessarily. So I think they can probably point out these emotion categories in a photo first. And then learning how to talk about their own emotions and express them is probably a bit more difficult, especially because although we think about sadness and fear as these things that live in the brain, a lot of our emotions are blends of lots of things. We don't just feel sadness. We feel sadness and anger and resentment all at the same time, and maybe a little anxiety. So it's really hard to describe your emotions. So I think I'm guessing that that's a little more difficult.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. My next question here is, what are some lesser known things that help a baby's development?
Um, well, I would say if we're talking about in the first year or two, I would say swaddling is really good for a baby, like wrapping them up really tightly because it makes them feel very secure. It helps them sleep. So that's really good. I feel like that's one of the lesser known things. I can tell you that my mom and like a lot of people from her generation would say, don't pick up the baby all the time. They'll want to be held all the time. And it turns out that being held is really good. And the more they're held, the better in terms of emotional development. So, I mean, maybe those are just a couple of misconceptions. I would also say, like, sleep training's not dangerous. People think sleep training is dangerous. People think that, circumcision is dangerous and it'll cause this sort of lifelong fear. And these are just myths.
Yeah. I mean, on the being wrapped tightly part, hell, I love being wrapped tightly, especially when it's
Same.
winter. So why not the baby,
I
right?
know. It's comforting. Why wouldn't you want to be wrapped tightly and warm in your mom's arms?
Exactly. My last question that I have here is, what are some realistic infant development milestones? I see baby milestone videos on social media all the time, and it's making me really anxious as my baby is very far behind. At 8 months old, my infant has fully mastered rolling, is really chatty, hates solid food apart from corn. Is this realistic?
I think it's totally fine and totally normal. The problem and this parent said it just right. The problem with milestones is it just makes people anxious, right? Like my baby's supposed to be here on this date and this time, and for the most part milestones are not really like set in stone and lots of things shift them around. So like babies tend to walk around 13 months in the US, but they walk sooner in other cultures where babies are expected to be more independent and where babies are carried all the time. So there's some moms who need to go right back to work and they carry their babies on their backs. Those babies walk later. And that's okay because they're not getting the experience moving around on the ground. So an 8-month old that's rolling around, it's trying to communicate. I think that that's fine. Picky eating is really, really common in infancy. One thing I would say is, the thing with eating is I would give the baby a few options and let them choose. Let them explore food and learn to enjoy food of different textures. Let them be a little independent if they're refusing to eat.
Yeah, I love that idea. A little buffet for the baby, a little baby
Yeah.
buffet.
Yeah. So I read this book once where the advice was, your job is to put food on the table. It's the child's job to decide what to eat and how much. It's not your job. And the child, it's one of the first things they have control over. And they like having control over that. And, as long as they're not starving, you should let them choose, we would give our kids a couple of options, and as long as they chose one, great.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. Thank you so much for answering the questions from the
No
internet with
problem.
us. It's been so fun. Now let's move on to the practices and habits debrief. And this is where we talk about the practical day to day application of what you've just shared with us. So, my first question for you is, what is a habit that you'd recommend parents or caregivers practicing to encourage healthy infant development?
Good question. Um, I would encourage letting the baby explore on their own as much as possible. Of course, you have to baby proof the house, but they want to explore, and encouraging exploration is a really great thing to do because they learn independence, they learn healthy emotional responses, and it helps you to be less anxious, to let go a little and let them explore. Exploring is the name of the game. Babies fall when they're learning to walk. Babies fall hundreds of times a day. Let them fall. Don't let them fall off a building, or don't let them fall off the bed. But remember that letting them explore is what they want to do. It's part of the game.
Yeah, I do imagine though it's really difficult as someone who's well, I'm not a parent, but I'm a really anxious person just naturally. So I imagine that if I have an infant walking around, I would want them to explore, but at the same time, I'm just chronically anxious in general. So what can people who are anxious have that anxiety about, letting their kids explore and getting themselves into potential trouble? What can those people do to curb that anxiety a little bit or overcome that fear?
Right. So the first thing is ask yourself whether the fear is realistic. So that means, like, is there really something threatening here? Is there really something dangerous here? So, of course, if there is, you shouldn't do it. Like, you have a reason to feel anxious if you have. So I had, when my first child was a toddler, I had stairs in my house that I had to put a gate up, right? You have to put a gate up so they don't fall down the stairs. That's a reasonable thing to be anxious about. But if you're anxious about that, then figure out a solution so that you're no longer anxious about it, right? If there's a solution like putting up a gate, put up a gate, you will feel better. And the other advice I would give is, like, if you think that you're an anxious person, think about how to cope with your own anxiety. I was in therapy for anxiety before I had kids. But then after my second child, I went on Lexapro to manage my anxiety, and it's been a lot better. And I'm more patient with them. And I'm not I'm not like this every time they do something. And I think that they are healthier and happier because of it. And so am I.
Yeah, I think my mom also probably had a similar experience to you where she was initially, because I'm the first child, she was really anxious with me. So it was very much like helicopter parenting a little bit. And then with the second and third child, it was kind of a letting looser. So yeah, I think the exposure therapy does help a little bit. But what would you say to first time parents who are still really afraid about this? How would you break that down into simple steps to help them give the bestow some autonomy onto their infant?
I mean, I would say take baby steps. The reason why we're less anxious with a second and third child is we've been through it already, right? We've had this experience before. So maybe try something new, see how it goes. Little baby steps. If that goes well, try a little bit more exploration. I mean, there's no right or wrong answer to any of these things, right? I mean, the best I can say is do the best you can, take care of yourself, and go slow if you're worried. Like, maybe give the baby a little bit more autonomy. Like, let yourself, if the baby's sitting and not walking yet, let yourself walk away for a second and then come back and see how that goes. Or, if there's no dangerous stairs in your house, let the baby play on the on the coffee table for a little while, and see how that feels. So, I mean, you can go slow. And remember, there's no rules for this.
Yeah, I really love the example of the baby buffet. And I'm really curious to know what are some other specific examples or like specific outlets where a parent could give their child a little bit of autonomy without the fear of, letting them roam around for too long, to do those baby steps.
Yeah, I mean, maybe at a park. There are lots of things that you can do to give the baby some autonomy while you're walking, while you're doing other things. I like to give my kids food on their like while I was cooking, like different kinds of food on their mat, and this way they got to play and explore. And don't worry about getting dirty. You're gonna get dirty. Let them have some fun.
Yeah. And another thing about like, letting your babies touch the food and eat it at the same time is that, anthropologically, we have always like in the past we connected with our food by touching them like with our hands, so it's natural and it develops that like that what's the word that sense, I think, the sense of
Yeah, the
touch in
sensory.
them,
Yeah.
the connection to the food, and it kind of unlocks that side in them, I suppose. So that's another like benefit of letting them explore and touch the food, let them
Yeah.
get dirty. Yeah.
And it's also that a lot of from what I've read from food scientists, a lot of the reasons why babies don't like things at first necessarily is the texture. They're not used to the texture in their mouth. So letting them touch it first at least gives them some exposure to those new textures before they put it in their mouth.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this has been such an interesting conversation and I've loved it so much, like as someone who doesn't even have an infant or plan to own an infant. I'm the
Oh,
most
oh.
like non-parent. I'm the most non-parent ever. But yeah,
I
it's
love
been
it.
super interesting to talk to you about this. And I hope it's been enlightening and insightful to parents as well. Now let's move on to the open mic segment, and this will be your opportunity to talk about anything that you're passionate about. And it doesn't have to be related to the topic, but if you want it to be, it can be as well. So the floor is all yours, Vanessa. Please take it away.
Um, I guess what I would say, if I got to go on a soapbox for a minute, is say that I think that um, if I have discovered anything through my career, it's that we should value and protect parents in the first couple years of life more than we do, particularly mothers. They need support. I think it's very, very unnatural for moms to have a baby and then everybody leaves and she's at home on maternity leave by herself with this newborn baby. I think having lots of people around you, I think having support, I think destigmatizing mental health services for new moms is really important. I would say that moms need help and we should help them because there are a lot of things that are really dependent on the parents and what happens in the home environment at these early ages. So, the more support we can give moms, the better the baby's going to do. And it's not something we often think of. We think of interventions with the baby. How's the baby? What's going on with the baby? And that's great. We should do that, but we have to remember to maintain our own mental health and to help moms maintain their mental health. Because having a baby is really stressful, like you said. I mean, it's really easy to stress out, especially with a first child. And what I've learned is sometimes anxiety and depression in these first few months of life. That's going to shape how the baby thinks about these emotions as well, and we want to help the baby and the mom, so we should just remember that. If I could say anything to the world, it would be help moms.
That's a really good use of the open mic. So thank you so much, Vanessa, for joining us today and for sharing that with us. I completely agree with you. I think that we have, lost so much of that focus on helping moms along the way because of modernization. We have learned to be a bit more isolated. We've learned to live on our own. We don't live with our parents or grandparents nearly as much as we did before. COVID didn't really help that either. So definitely help moms. And if our listeners want to find out more about you and what you do, where can they go?
They can go to my website. So they can go to they can look us up. We're the Child Study Center at Rutgers University in Newark. It has all of the work that we're doing, all of the papers, media coverage. Hopefully I'll get to post a link to this podcast on there. It also has my contact info and the contact info from all of the amazing scientists that are part of my lab, my students, my postdocs, my staff. So that's where to find everything about us. And please do reach out.
All right, amazing. We'll leave those in the show notes. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
You've been listening to Raising Parents, the Parenting Science Insights podcast, produced by the Parenting Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it so that we can grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at pa.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Dina Sargent. Thanks for tuning in.